Picture this. You're standing in the Tower Green of London on a misty morning in May 1536. The air smells of damp stone and freshly cut grass. Around you, a small crowd has gathered, no more than 1,000 souls, all witnesses hand-picked by the king himself. You can hear the Thames lapping against the tower walls, the cawing of ravens overhead. Before you stands a wooden scaffold, hastily constructed, draped in black cloth. And on that scaffold, a woman in a grey damask gown trimmed with fur waits to die. She's only 35 years old. Her name is Anne Boleyn, and 3 years ago she was crowned Queen of England with more pageantry and splendour than England had seen in generations. Now she's about to lose her head, not for treason in any conventional sense, not for conspiracy against the realm, but for something far more complex, far more human, and far more devastating. What Henry VIII did to Anne Boleyn represents one of the most calculated character assassinations in recorded history, a systematic destruction of a woman who dared to believe that a king's love could protect her. Before diving into this forgotten story of ambition and survival, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand Anne Boleyn, you must first understand that she wasn't born to be queen. She wasn't even born to be particularly important. Anne was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, a skilled diplomat and social climber, and Elizabeth Howard, whose family connections gave the Boleyns just enough aristocratic polish to gain access to court. Born around 1501 or 1507, historians still debate the exact year, Anne spent her formative years not in England, but in the sophisticated courts of Europe. At around 12 years old, she was sent to serve in the household of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands, and later to the French court, where she served Queen Claude. This wasn't unusual for daughters of ambitious families. What was unusual was how thoroughly Anne absorbed the continental sophistication, the French fashions, the clever repartee, the dangerous game of courtly love. When she returned to England around 1521, she was unlike any woman the English court had seen. She wore her dark hair loose in the French style. She could dance with a grace that made men stop their conversations. She could debate theology and poetry with an intelligence that was both thrilling and slightly threatening. She wasn't conventionally beautiful by Tudor standards. Her skin was too dark, they whispered. Her eyes too black, her mouth too wide. But she possessed something far more powerful than mere beauty. She had presence, she had wit, and she knew exactly how to use both. The system was designed to keep women like Anne in their place. In the 1520s, women at the English court existed in a carefully structured hierarchy. At the top sat Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's queen of 18 years, the daughter of Spanish royalty, beloved by the people, pious and dignified. Below her, ladies-in-waiting served in elaborate rituals of deference. These women were ornaments, chess pieces in their family's political games. They were expected to be beautiful, obedient, and silent unless spoken to. They could flirt, courtly love was an accepted game, but within strict boundaries. A woman could inspire devotion, write poetry, exchange favors, but she must never, ever overstep. Marriage was arranged by families for political advantage. A woman's virtue was her family's asset, and everyone understood the rules. Everyone knew their place. Anne Boleyn looked at this system and decided to rewrite it entirely. By 1526, something had fundamentally shifted in the king's heart. Henry VIII was 35 years old, still handsome, still athletic, but increasingly desperate. Catherine of Aragon had given him one surviving child, a daughter, Mary. But Henry needed a son. The Tudor dynasty was young, established by his father after decades of civil war. Without a male heir, England could descend into chaos again. Henry had convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine was cursed, that God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow. He wanted an annulment, He wanted to be free. And then he saw Anne Boleyn, not her younger sister Mary, who had already been his mistress, not the dozens of other available women at court. Anne. And Anne, unlike every other woman before her, said no. He wasn't a monster yet. In fact, in those early years of his pursuit, Henry VIII was almost endearing in his desperation. Starting in 1526, he began writing Anne love letters. 17 survive today, preserved because Anne kept them, perhaps as insurance, perhaps as trophies. These letters reveal a king transformed into a lovesick boy. "I beg to know expressly your intention touching the love between us," he wrote in one. In another, more desperate, "Henceforth my heart shall be dedicated to you alone, greatly wishing that my body could be as well." He sent her gifts, a bracelet with his miniature portrait, bucks from his royal hunt, cloth of gold and silver. He elevated her father and brother to positions of influence. He made her Marquess of Pembroke in her own right, an almost unprecedented honor for an unmarried woman. But Anne held firm. She would not be his mistress. She would be his wife and queen, or nothing at all. It was a gamble that would either make her the most powerful woman in England or destroy her completely. What makes this particularly disturbing is that Anne had no real choice but to gamble. She was already in her mid-20s, dangerously old by Tudor standards to remain unmarried. Her earlier betrothal to Henry Percy had been broken off, some said by Cardinal Wolsey at the king's request, though this may have been later invention. Her family was pushing her toward the king. To refuse Henry completely would mean social death, perhaps literal danger. To accept becoming his mistress would mean temporary pleasure, followed by inevitable abandonment, as her sister Mary had discovered. Mary Boleyn had been Henry's mistress for several years in the early 1520s and received almost nothing for it. No titles, no advancement, no security. When Henry tired of her, she was married off to a minor courtier and forgotten. Anne watched her sister's fate and understood that a woman's power at court was as fragile as morning mist unless she held an official position. So she walked a tightrope, keeping Henry obsessed but not satisfied, promising everything while giving nothing, year after year after year. By the time Cardinal Wolsey fell from power in 1529, unable to secure the annulment from Rome that Henry demanded, Anne had already accumulated enemies. Catherine of Aragon's supporters saw her as a homewrecker, a schemer who had seduced the king away from his virtuous wife. The common people despised her. They loved Queen Catherine and saw Anne as the foreign-educated temptress who whispered Lutheran heresies in the king's ear. The old aristocracy resented her family's rise. But Anne also had supporters. Reformers who wanted to break from Rome rallied around her. Ambitious men who saw opportunity in the chaos. And Henry himself, increasingly isolated by his obsession, increasingly convinced that God wanted him to marry Anne and father sons. The political situation had become a stalemate. Catherine would not accept an annulment. The Pope, under pressure from Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor, would not grant one, and Henry's patience was running out. Then Henry made the most radical decision of his reign. If the Pope would not grant him what he wanted, he would break from Rome entirely. In 1533, after 6 years of pursuit, Henry secretly married Anne in January. She was already pregnant. In May, the newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cromwell, declared Henry's marriage to Catherine invalid. On June 1st, 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England in a ceremony of unprecedented magnificence. Ships lined the Thames, their cannons firing salutes. Musicians played from barges decorated with gold. Anne, 6 months pregnant, rode through London streets in a litter of white cloth of gold, wearing a surcoat of purple velvet and a coronet studded with precious stones. The pageantry cost a fortune. It was Henry's declaration to the world. This woman was his chosen queen, and anyone who doubted it was challenging the king himself. But even at her coronation, cracks showed in the foundation of Anne's power. According to Eustace Chapuis, the Spanish ambassador and Catherine's fierce supporter, the London crowds watched in hostile silence. Few people cried, "God save the Queen," as Anne passed. Some even mocked her. The letter H and A intertwined, symbols of Henry and Anne, were whispered to stand for "ha ha." Whether this was true or diplomatic exaggeration, the perception mattered. Anne began her reign not as a beloved queen, but as a controversial figure who had divided the kingdom, and she knew it. Contemporary accounts describe her as increasingly anxious, quick to anger, desperate to please the king, while also asserting her own will. She was walking into a trap, though she couldn't see it yet. The same qualities that had captivated Henry, her intelligence, her fierce independence, her refusal to be meek, would eventually become the weapons used to destroy her. On September 7, 1533, Anne gave birth. The astrologers had predicted a son. Letters announcing the birth of a prince had already been prepared, but the child was a girl. They named her Elizabeth. Henry tried to hide his disappointment, but everyone at court understood what this meant. Anne's greatest protection, her ability to give Henry sons, had failed at the first test. She was still young, still capable of more children, but the shadow of doubt had been planted. If God had blessed this marriage, surely he would have given them a son immediately. What if the king's new marriage was as cursed as his old one? Over the next 2 years, Anne suffered at least 2 miscarriages. Historical records are incomplete, but evidence suggests she lost a pregnancy in the summer of 1534 and another in 1536. Each loss diminished her power. Each failure gave her enemies hope. Meanwhile, Anne as queen was discovering that the role demanded skills she didn't possess. As a mistress in waiting, her sharp tongue and quick wit had been charming. As queen, these same qualities were seen as shrewish and inappropriate. She argued with Henry about policy. She criticized his advisors openly. She mocked him when he took new mistresses, demanding fidelity she couldn't enforce. She had expected that becoming queen would give her security. Instead, she found herself in a position that required constant performance, constant pregnancy, constant deference to a man who was growing bored with her. What Anne didn't understand was that Henry VIII's love was not a shelter, but a spotlight, and the moment she stepped out of that light, she would be vulnerable. By early 1536, Henry had found a new obsession: Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting. Jane was everything Anne was not: pale, blonde, quiet, submissive. She played the same game Anne had once played, refusing to be Henry's mistress, insisting on marriage. But this time, Anne was the obstacle, and Henry, who had torn apart Christendom to marry Anne, now wanted to be free of her. In January 1536, on the day Catherine of Aragon died, Anne miscarried a male child. She had been about 3.5 months pregnant. Some historians believe the miscarriage was triggered by the shock of Henry's fall during a jousting tournament days earlier, when the king had been knocked unconscious for 2 hours and everyone feared he was dead. When Henry regained consciousness and visited Anne, she was distraught with relief. But when she lost the baby shortly after, Henry's reaction was cold. According to several accounts, he told her, "I see that God will not give me male children." And then, devastatingly, "When you are up, I will come and speak to you." He never spoke to her privately again. What happened next has been debated by historians for centuries, but the sequence of events suggests careful planning. On April 30th, 1536, less than 4 months after Anne's miscarriage, a young musician named Mark Smeaton was arrested. Under interrogation, probably under torture, though no records confirm this, he confessed to adultery with the Queen. This was the opening Henry's advisors needed. The next day, May 1st, during a May Day joust at Greenwich, Anne allegedly dropped her handkerchief to a courtier. Henry stood abruptly and left without explanation. Anne would never see him again. By that evening, she was arrested and taken to the Tower of London by barge, the same route she had travelled in triumph 3 years earlier for her coronation. She was accused of adultery with 5 men: Mark Smeaton, Sir Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, William Brereton, and her own brother George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford. The charges were explosive: adultery, conspiracy to murder the king, and incest. If proven, they carried the death penalty. The evidence against Anne was laughably thin, constructed from gossip, misinterpreted conversations, and courtly flirtation. The indictment claimed she had committed adultery with Norris on October 6, 1533, November 12, 1533, and December 2, 1533, dates when Anne was either recovering from childbirth or provably in different locations from her alleged lovers. It claimed she had seduced her brother George on November 5, 1535, at Westminster, despite the fact that no evidence placed them alone together that day. The charges described Anne as operating a conspiracy where she promised to marry one of her lovers after the king's death, an absurd claim, as everyone knew such a marriage would be impossible and would plunge England into civil war. But Henry didn't need real evidence. He needed a legal framework to remove Anne, and the law of treason provided it. Because Anne was queen, any adultery she committed was automatically treason. It threatened the legitimacy of the royal succession. Because she was accused of plotting the king's death, even discussing such things was treason. The law was designed to protect the king, and now it would be used to destroy his wife. The psychological impact was shattering. Anne was taken to the same apartments in the Tower where she had stayed before her coronation. Sir William Kingston, the constable of the Tower, was assigned to watch her constantly. We know details of her imprisonment because Kingston wrote regular reports to Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister and the architect of Anne's destruction. In these letters, Anne emerges as a woman swinging between defiance and collapse. She laughed hysterically at times. She wept inconsolably at others. She asked repeatedly about the men accused with her, particularly about Norris and her brother George. She wondered aloud why she was being held. She protested her innocence, and in moments of dark clarity, she seemed to understand that none of it mattered. "The king has been very good to me," she said with bitter irony. "He promoted me from a simple maid to be a marchioness. Then he raised me to be a queen. Now he will raise me to be a martyr." On May 15, 1536, the 5 men accused with Anne were tried at Westminster Hall. The evidence against them was circumstantial at best. Norris, the king's close friend and groom of the stool, had allegedly told Anne he would look for dead men's shoes, interpreted as meaning he hoped Henry would die so he could marry Anne, though it could just as easily have been a comment about court positions. Weston and Brereton were accused based on overheard conversations and the fact that they were frequently in Anne's presence, as their court positions required. George Boleyn was accused of discussing the king's sexual dysfunction with Anne and of entering her chambers at inappropriate times. Mark Smeaton's confession was the only direct evidence, and even that was vague and contradictory. The trial was a formality. All 5 men were convicted and sentenced to death. Mark Smeaton, as a commoner, was hanged, drawn, and quartered. The others, being nobles, were granted the mercy of beheading. They died on May 17th on Tower Hill, in front of crowds that had once bowed to them. 2 days later, on May 19th, it was Anne's turn. But first, she had to endure her own trial. On May 15th, Anne was brought to the King's Hall in the Tower, where 2,000 spectators had gathered. Peers of the realm, foreign ambassadors, merchants who had paid for the privilege of witnessing a queen's humiliation. Anne entered dressed in grey, a colour of mourning. She stood accused before 27 peers, presided over by her own uncle, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. The charges were read aloud: multiple counts of adultery, conspiracy to murder the king, incest with her brother. Anne listened calmly. Then she spoke in her own defense. We don't have a transcript of her words, but witnesses reported she answered each charge methodically, denying everything. She explained away the conversations that had been twisted into evidence. She pointed out the impossibility of the dates and locations. She spoke with such composure and intelligence that some observers were swayed. But the verdict was never in doubt. Every peer voted guilty. Not one voice spoke for her. Her uncle, the man who had helped arrange her marriage to Henry, read the sentence. Thou shalt be burnt here within the Tower of London on the green, else to have thy head smitten off, as the king's pleasure shall be further known. Anne heard the sentence without tears. She simply said, O Father, O Creator, thou who art the way, the truth, and the life, knowest whether I have deserved this death. Then she was taken back to her apartments to wait. Henry, showing a last flicker of the man who had once written her love letters, granted Anne a mercy. She would not be burned or beheaded by the standard axe. Instead, he sent to France for an expert swordsman who would execute her with a single swift stroke. It was both a kindness and a final insult. The sword was considered a more honorable death, reserved for nobility, but it also ensured the execution would be quick and efficient, allowing Henry to move on without delay. On the evening of May 18th, Archbishop Cranmer visited Anne and annulled her marriage to Henry. This legal fiction meant that she had never truly been queen, which made the charges against her even more absurd. How could she commit adultery and treason if she had never been legally married? But it served Henry's purposes. It bastardized their daughter Elizabeth. It erased Anne from history as thoroughly as possible. And it meant Henry could remarry immediately without committing bigamy. Anne spent her last night in prayer and writing letters. She asked for the sacrament to be brought to her at dawn. According to Kingston's reports, she told her ladies, I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck. Then she put her hands around her neck and laughed, a terrible, frightening sound in the darkness. Kingston wrote to Cromwell, I have seen many men and women executed, but I have never seen anyone make so much preparation. Anne, facing death, was trying to control the only thing she still could, her final performance. She would die with dignity. She would give them no satisfaction of seeing her break. May 19th, 1536, dawned clear and mild. Anne rose before dawn and heard Mass. She dressed carefully in a damask gown lined with fur, with an English gable hood. Over this, she wore a crimson petticoat, red, the liturgical color of martyrdom. Around her neck, she wore a pearl necklace. At around 8 in the morning, she was led from her apartments across the Tower Green to the scaffold. About 1,000 people had been allowed inside the tower walls to witness the execution. The scaffold was low, only about 4 feet high, draped in black cloth. Straw had been scattered on the platform. The swordsman from France waited, his weapon hidden in the straw so Anne wouldn't see it beforehand. Anne climbed the steps steadily. She stood before the crowd, and in her final moments, she did something remarkable. Despite everything, the betrayal, the false charges, the systematic destruction of her reputation, she followed the protocol required of condemned traitors. She praised the king. Good Christian people, she began, her voice carrying across the silent crowd. I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law, I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that, whereof I am accused and condemned to die. Then, incredibly, I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle and sovereign lord. Some historians believe she spoke these words to protect Elizabeth, hoping that by praising Henry, she might secure some safety for her daughter. Others believe she was following the expected formula to spare her family further punishment. Still others think she was being devastatingly ironic, using courtesy as a weapon. Perhaps it was all three. She continued, And if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best. And thus I take my leave of the world and of you all, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me. She asked her ladies to help her remove her headdress and collar, exposing her neck. Her hair was bound up in a coif. She gave a small purse of money to the executioner, traditional payment. Then she knelt on the straw. The swordsman had positioned himself carefully. Unlike an axe execution, where the condemned laid their head on a block, Anne knelt upright, blindfolded, praying. The executioner had to approach from the side or front. To distract her, he called out, "Fetch me the sword," sending Anne's attention to her right. In that moment, he swung from her left. The blade was sharp, the stroke practiced. It severed her head cleanly in a single blow. Her lips continued moving in prayer for several seconds after. An attendant retrieved the head and body, placing both in an elm arrow chest. The authorities hadn't even provided a proper coffin. Anne Boleyn, who had been crowned with more ceremony than any queen before her, was buried without marker or memorial in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower walls. The immediate aftermath was chaos managed into order by Thomas Cromwell's efficient machinery. Within hours of Anne's death, Henry was dressed in white, the mourning colour of French royalty, but notably not black, the English colour of mourning, and travelling to see Jane Seymour. 10 days later, on May 30th, Henry and Jane were formally betrothed. They married on May 30th, just 11 days after Anne's execution. Henry had been so eager to move forward that he couldn't wait even a month. Jane would give him the son he craved, Edward, born in October 1537. But she died of complications 12 days after childbirth. Henry eventually married 4 more times, desperate for more sons, suspicious of every wife. But Anne haunted him. Courtiers reported that in his final years, sick and obese, Henry sometimes called out for Anne in his sleep. He never spoke her name publicly. He had her images removed from palaces, her initials chiseled off stonework. But he kept Elizabeth, raised her at court, and in his final years seemed to take pride in his brilliant red-haired daughter who had her mother's intelligence and wit. The long-term consequences rippled through generations. Thomas Cromwell, who had orchestrated Anne's destruction, would himself be executed 4 years later on similarly manufactured charges, learning too late that Henry's favour was a death sentence waiting to happen. The Boleyn family was shattered. Anne's father died within 18 months, disgraced. Her sister Mary disappeared into obscurity. Her brother George's wife, who had testified against him, became a pariah. But most tragically, the precedent had been set. Henry had proven that a queen could be removed not through papal annulment or diplomatic negotiation, but through simple accusation and execution. Catherine Howard, his 5th wife and Anne's cousin, would die the same way in 1542, her head falling to the same axe that had taken George Boleyn. The message was clear. In Henry VIII's England, no woman was safe, no matter her rank, if the king's desire turned to hatred. What makes Anne Boleyn's story so haunting isn't just the speed of her fall or the cruelty of her execution. It's the systematic way her entire existence was rewritten to justify her death. Within days of her execution, court poets were writing verses praising Jane Seymour and never mentioning Anne's name. Chroniclers recorded her crimes as historical fact. For decades, she was remembered primarily as the scheming adulteress who had seduced Henry away from good Queen Catherine and paid the price for her ambition. It took centuries for historians to piece together a more nuanced truth from the scattered evidence. The impossibility of the dates in the charges, the lack of any credible witnesses, the political motivations of her accusers, the convenient timing of her arrest just as Henry wanted to remarry. Modern historians largely agree that Anne was innocent of adultery and certainly innocent of the conspiracy charges. She was destroyed not because of what she did, but because of who she was, an intelligent, independent woman who had dared to negotiate her own value and lost. Perhaps most tragically, Anne's greatest achievement was forgotten in the scandal of her death. She had pushed Henry to break from Rome, inadvertently beginning the English Reformation. She had patronized religious reformers and scholars. She had fought for education and charity reform. She had given birth to Elizabeth I, who would become England's greatest monarch, ruling for 45 years and ushering in a golden age of English culture and power. But Anne never knew any of this. She died believing herself a failure, her marriage annulled, her daughter declared a bastard, her name becoming a byword for female treachery. In her final letter, written to Henry but never sent, she begged him to remember that she had always been his faithful and devoted wife. The letter was found among the Tower records centuries later. Henry never read it. Anne Boleyn's story reminds us that power built on desire rather than law is as unstable as quicksand. She rose because Henry wanted her, and she fell because he wanted someone else. No amount of intelligence, charm, or political skill could protect her from the fundamental vulnerability of her position. Behind the grand narrative of the English Reformation and the birth of modern England, there is an individual human story of a woman who gambled everything on a king's love and lost. She was 35 years old when she died, daughter, sister, wife, mother, queen, and in the end, none of those roles could save her. Even across the vast gulf of nearly 5 centuries, her final words echo with devastating grace. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die." The Queen, who had remade England and challenged the Pope, had been reduced to a woman alone on a scaffold, praising the man who had ordered her death, hoping against hope that somehow, in some way, her daughter might survive the wreckage.